Today's guest is Phil Andrews. He is the sitting Chief Executive Officer for USA Fencing, but he's had a long career in sport administration. This is his second CEO post for a USA National Governing Body, having spent the better part of 10 years at USA Weightlifting. He became the CEO 6 years prior to joining USA Fencing in the same title. So he's got 10 plus years as the lead executive in two very important, what I will call not the major league Olympic sports, but I will say tier two. And Phil's going to probably take some issue with that because he very much liked fencing to be tier one. But prior to that, a long career starting in the earliest days of volunteering, of starting his own business at age 14, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. So, Phil, I can't thank you enough. Welcome to the Best Boss Ever podcast.
Thanks, Carl. Appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure. So we start everyone with the exact same question. You've had a storied career. You are in the midst of it now in your second chief executive role. So in the run up to becoming a CEO for the first time, who was, maybe more than one who, the best boss, the best leader, the best mentor you ever had? What did you learn from that individual or individuals? And what of those learnings have you taken with you to date?
You know, I always go back to a guy called Paul Thompson, who was the head coach of the ice hockey team I worked for in the UK, who is still to this day. I was so lucky to come across him so early in my career. He wasn't directly my boss, although he had an ownership stake in the team by that point. The way he led performance, the way he led his team, the way he thought about business, the way he thought about his team on the field of play, certainly has had a continued influence on me throughout my career, both in the business side and the sporting side of the brain, if you like. So Tom, I would definitely lead that. He's actually back in the UK coaching now, but went on to coach in Sweden, in Denmark, in Germany, Italy briefly, I believe, as well. And he ended up in coaching partly because he was a BT phone engineer. BT is British Telecom. It's like a bit like AT&T here. So he got a major back injury when he was playing and ended up giving up being a BT phone engineer to coach professional hockey. So if that's not a odd journey to professional sport, I don't know what is. But at the same place, in pro hockey, there was a gentleman named Andy Buxton who'd come out of a very large European business who was our chair. And again, between the two of them and a lady called Sally Mayers at the same place, I learned a lot from that group at Coventry Blaze. And actually earlier this year, for the first time in many years, I made it back to Coventry to the Sky Dome and saw Sally and a couple of the others almost 20 years after I was there professionally, and on the anniversary too of a win of what's called the Challenge Cup in the UK. But hockey is not quite the same size as it is here. Those arenas are 4,000 or 5,000 people, but it was a really nice sort of full circle moment. But I'd probably say there's been a lot of people across the years, don't get me wrong, but I'd probably say that the folks at Coventry Blaze, chiefly Tomo, was the people I usually think of when I get asked a similar question.
Right. Well, everybody who gets asked that question, at least by me, and there are north of 110 of them to date, including yourself, answers it pretty much the same way. If I had to boil it down to one or two or maybe three, as you have, I will do. But there are so many more that influenced me, that helped me, and quite the opposite as well, that you helped them. And it's always, in my view, when you get right down to it, it's a pretty fun two-way street to be on, because the camaraderie, the respect, the admiration, but also the growth, the intelligence, the experiences that come out of those relationships, you can't buy them.
You're right, and you know it's. I get to go to a wedding of one of the folks who works for me at fencing, and they work for me at weightlifting, and it was a tremendous honor to be asked to go, but made me reflect on the time I'd spent with that individual and what they'd done for both of those organizations and how they'd grown over that time, and frankly what they taught me over that time. And I don't work for them technically. I do in some manner, but you know, each time I've been frankly the CEO when he's been with us. So he went away and got what I called his lacrosse MBA at US Lacrosse for a little while, but it's you're right. You build those relationships over years. One of the things I was tremendously proud of in both weightlifting and fencing is how we kept our teams together over a number of years, and nobody really left. And in some manner, it's nice to get people coming in with new ideas, but it's also you grow as sort of a. I don't particularly love that comparison of family when it comes to work teams. I think for some people that can be really positive, for others it can have negative connotations. But I do love the word community, and growing as a community, I think is what we did at both of those organizations. But 100% correct. It's not just the people that you've been your boss over time. It's the people you've learned from, who you might have been their boss, and sometimes they're your fellow, in our case, CEO of another NGB, and in some cases it's experiences that you move on. I guess what I'm trying to say is, okay, I've now been running US national governing bodies for over 10 years, but I will learn probably just as much about being a good boss in the next 10 as I did in the last 10.
Right. Right. Well, you're always learning, you're always growing. And just by what I've heard you say so far, that for sure is one of your, if you will, core mission planks, is to continue to learn, continue to grow, and understand as time goes on the more nuanced elements of high quality, excellent leadership. And clearly, with 10 years under your belt right now, you're well on your way.
We're trying.
Yeah.
So it's we're trying. It's not something I thought I'd end up doing. We've talked about this a little bit before we came on. How I ultimately fell into sport leadership positions or sport administration positions, and being privileged to lead two communities and two sports in the US, neither of which I did in any meaningful manner as a sportsman myself. And it's been remarkable. I never would have expected to have ended up doing this, sitting there as a 10-year-old in, the home counties of Great Britain.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because as we record this, we're inside of 2 years away from opening ceremonies in Los Angeles, LA 28. You've got multiple obligations, responsibilities, and requirements over the next 2 years to get the USA fencing team ready. But let's talk about your very first Olympic experience. And if I've got this right, it started around about 2010 in London in the run up to the London 2012 games.
That's right. Yeah, so we meaning the University of East London, who I was a part of at that time, hosted a number of Olympic and Paralympic clients, or if you like, for the Olympic and Paralympic Games for London. Which, by the way, the catchphrase for that games was "Inspire a Generation." The idea was it was supposed to inspire a generation of new athletes for London, and I certainly hope LA can do the same here in the United States. Something we're focusing a lot of our time and energy on here in fencing. I guess I should probably look back and I suppose those games inspired a different career change or career pathway for me. So not quite what was meant by inspire a generation, but it certainly inspired a generation of life for me. But I ended up working with Team USA, then the USOC. Not yet the USOPC in London, with some folks who have been around up until very recently, and some folks who are still indeed with the USOPC. And the primary thing we did there was hosted the High Performance Training Center. So for those who don't know what that means, during the games, at least for the last number of games, the USOPC has put on the ground essentially an Olympic and Paralympic training center that can be used for the advantage of Team USA. And this idea has now spread to other nations. GB does it, other nations do it, but Team USA, if I might say, still does it the best.
So let's talk about a high performance training center, because the requirements of 38 national governing body groups of Olympic athletes coming to a specific games, in this case, London, the training requirements are quite different. I mean, I rather think strength training, stretching, therapies, be it hot, cold, or in between, everything from physical therapy to massage, those kinds of things, I think, run the course across most, if not all, of the Olympic sports. But we're not talking about there was a track and field, there was a water polo pool, there was a hockey, or not hockey, a soccer pitch, or are we?
So, yes and no. We didn't have every single bit of that at the University of East London. London obviously is a challenging location in terms of the availability of real estate, quite frankly. So we had the primary site. We also had some other facilities for Team USA, things like what we then called outfitting is now called the Team USA Welcome Program. So there was a couple of satellite sites other than ours, which dealt specifically with track and field, because you need a track for that. And there was a I am actually forgetting what happened with the pool. So the two biggest medal sports were not with us full time. We did have the strength and conditioning side, the sports science side of that. We had a number of the swimmers and the track and field folks who stayed with us on site at the University of East London. I should point out we had two campuses, one next to the Excel Centre, which had a lot of the indoor sports like a boxing, fencing, judo, weightlifting. And then there was another campus actually right next to the Olympic Park, although that didn't necessarily dictate what was trained at each of those places. So one of the advantages that we had for the USOPC, as I say, than the USOC at UEL, I swear I won't use more alphabet soup, was that we were actually building what became known as the sports dock. And the sports stock, therefore, could somewhat be manipulated to the requirements of Team USA. So, one example of that is we ended up actually changing the height of the ceiling because of volleyball. In the UK, volleyball's not really a major sport. So, the last time that volleyball was probably played in any type of earnest was likely in 2012 in that particular building. But the reason that ceiling height matches a regulation volleyball height is because of Team USA.
Got it. The things you don't know that you have to do to accommodate, right?
It was, to your point, it was really interesting going through that experience in accommodating all those different sports. And it was fascinating to see there's a gentleman named Doug Ingram who is still doing some work in this type of pre-games planning stuff. And his mind, he has forgotten more about the logistics of an Olympic and Paralympic Games than most of us will ever know.
Right. Right. It's a combination of art and science, and I think you have to love it. I mean, you got
Oh,
to
yeah.
be willing to spend long, long hours because as games get nearer and near to go time, the logistical requirements, the infrastructure requirements, invariably you're going to forget something or oops, the ceiling's not high enough. Now we got to address the ceiling structure. So, Phil, is it fair to say that you sort of caught the Olympic sport bug on the back of what you did in the UK at
I,
East London University?
I think that's right. I think that's a reasonable assessment. It was an experience going through that and being part of, for want of better terminology, the Olympic Paralympic movement at the time. I think it definitely gave a bug would be right. And to your point, when you don't realize how much goes on from the outside in sports administration, and I include the pro sports side in that. I mean, part of the reason I feel like we've been so successful in the small teams we had at USA Weightlifting and then here at USA Fencing is certainly from a perspective of how do we make that work, is because having worked in professional ice hockey where you're running an entire pro team's operations on 3-4 people, or at one point in my life one person, then you learn how to put a number of hats on. And I think that's really important in running an NGB. So yeah, that was a long way of saying yes, I did. I grabbed the Olympic bug in 2012.
Well, it's served you well, clearly. I want to talk a little bit. I got a couple of things I want to dive into a little bit. One is arguably, since London 2012, there was a bit of a dip on if you will, the Summer Olympic side. Rio was, I want to say, good, in my opinion, just one man's opinion, not great, due to any number of mitigating factors. And then fast forward 4 years from then, pandemic hits, Tokyo has to get flipped from 2020 to 2021. Obviously, attendance dramatically impacted, the economics dramatically impacted. And I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, many folks were happy coming out of Tokyo. Some were, obviously. And then you have what happened 2 years ago, the high water mark in Paris. I mean, the French did, by all accounts, a really amazing job of producing an extraordinary Olympic Games. Every games with the orders, plural, of magnitude that the modern Olympics requires is going to be fraught with idiosyncrasies, backstage, if you will, mess ups, production mess ups that the television audience doesn't necessarily see. But I wonder if you agree with that assessment, and then I want to talk a little bit about a couple of other noteworthy occurrences that have happened over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for a British person, still by birth and by, and my heart shared across three nations with my three nationalities. But it's difficult for a guy who grew up in Britain to admit the French did it better than us. So I have to enter the comment of no comment there. But ultimately, I do agree that I felt Paris was somewhat a make or break summer games at least for the Olympic and Paralympic movement, and I think Paris 24, the IOC, the IPC indeed, and I'd have to say NBC as well did a really good job of being quite thoughtful and innovative in the way that they presented the games, the way that they integrated what I might call modern attention techniques. So the obvious one's the Snoop Dogg item. We had him out fencing against Miles Chamley Watson, and I think that was the first sport he actually did. And it was sure enough, 21 million people saw that on our Instagram stories alone, or Instagram Reels, I apologize. So it was I think a wonderfully executed games. I think Paris did an amazing job of using their city to its fullest possible degree, and I think it was really well. I can't speak for other countries, but the coverage in the United States, I guess I can speak for GB because I saw some of the BBC stuff towards the end because I was in England. I thought it was really well done by the worldwide broadcasters, so there was clearly a degree of coordination that happened there either by P24 or by the IOC. And the Olympic movement went under some significant challenges, some integrity challenges, some commercial challenges, some marketing challenges, some, in some cases, some leadership change from Jacques Throg to Thomas Bach to now to Kirsty Coventry over the IOC leadership side, but each of which brings new priorities and new changes with it, even though they may have got on with their predecessor. So it's been an interesting journey since London 2012, to your point, over some 14 years to watch the Olympic and Paralympic movement grow. But with my British hat on, I could not possibly tell you that Paris was better than London, but as somebody who runs USA Fencing and USA Weightlifting, it was the lift that we needed.
Cool. I get that. I truly do. So you mentioned Kirsty Coventry, the now, I guess, a little more than 1 year in the post as the CEO of the IOC, but noteworthy, I would say arguably the second or maybe even close to tied to the most powerful woman in the Olympic movement is Sarah Hirshland, the CEO of the USOPC, sitting, I don't know, a couple of miles from you, perhaps, in the USOPC offices in Colorado Springs. But those two women, Sarah firstly, because she's been in the post pre-pandemic, if memory serves.
18, I think, early 18.
I think that's right. And then the appointment, or I guess the election of Kirsty Coventry as the IOC president, those two women, in my view, while they have very different roles respectively, they have together been a really strong force for good so far. That's my take.
I mean, if we're taking the women's side, I tend to agree with you, Carl. I think both have been good. I'd probably want to give an honourable mention to Lily Lung, who was CEO for a long time of USA Gymnastics and steered that organisation, as did Sarah, out of the abyss, quite frankly.
The abyss is an accurate way to describe it. Whoa.
And so she had a turnaround job and a half, and running an NGB in the best of times is not easy. Running it in the circumstances Lily inherited was tremendously challenging, and Sarah faced similar challenges. But I think if you think about those, as you described, Kirsty and Sarah, as sort of, if you like, a power 1-2 punch in the IOC and the USOPC, I don't find that inaccurate at all. But I think the same could be said in terms of the way that the whole Olympic and Paralympic movement had to come out of the crisis of 2017, with, first of all, Suzanne Lyons as an interim CEO, who was then took back her post as chair, and then was Sarah's first chair, alongside then Lily coming in as CEO of USA Gymnastics. I think those two have been amazing. So too, again, if we go down this road of female leadership, the remarkable, in very different circumstances, a remarkable change that we've seen in US ski snowboard under Sophie Goldschmidt.
Right.
I'm a big fan of her predecessor, Tiger Shore. We're still friends to this day. But at the same time, I thought that was a really, really well run organization when she took it over. So in some ways, it's an equally challenging item to change when you come into a really successful organization that, on the face of it, is one of the most successful organizations of its type in the world.
Correct.
If not the most successful in the world under Tiger's leadership. And actually, Sophie went, hold my beer, and has really made it even more successful, has put skiing into much more places, and has come up with some quite revolutionary, might be a bit much, but quite on the front foot ideas that you aren't seeing in a lot of other sports organizations, never mind national governing bodies. So you're right, I think her first year's been good. I think she's got the right ideas. I think she's balancing the idea of the business side of what we have to do as sport, and by this I mean, to be honest, the right sizing of the games for Brisbane, and the idea of we all need to push our sports to be more modern, might be the wrong way of saying it, but being more relevant was the words that the IOC used, and I think she's right. And then, Sarah sort of somewhat bringing the US through that same journey, and of course through the LA28 journey, if you like, having inherited the deal between LA28 and the USOPC and having to figure out, okay, I came from golf and Wasserman and now the team, and primarily have commercial expertise and marketing expertise. How do I define an entirely new business model for a $400+ million organization,
Right,
which now has this deal in place that I wasn't part of, that didn't imagine a pandemic? So Sarah had to do a lot, not just in the traditional ways a CEO of a NOC, a National Olympic Committee, might have to do, but a lot in redefining how the USOPC at its very core actually operates, and then had to partner with NBC, and this may be to a degree where her marketing expertise came to the fore, at least behind the scenes, on that really great delivery of Paris, and the work of Katie Bynum and Jess Park especially, in how they drove the idea of we are not just a sport organization, we are actually a fan and entertainment organization.
That's a nuance that is probably lost on most, if you will, consumers or even the most ardent watchers of Olympic sport programming. They sit back and get the benefit of what you just described. An
Correct.
entertainment organization, the technologies that came out of Michael Milano Cortina with the drone footage, just one example of what NBC Sports so effectively deployed. It gave the viewer visuals, close-ups, literally put them on the pitch or down the slope or on the ice in a really extraordinary way. And I mean, to your point about Sophie Goldschmidt, sitting CEO of US Ski and Snowboarding, combined with Sarah, the Olympic Games happen here in 2 years' time, LA28, and then 6 years post that, they come back to the United States in Salt Lake City, 2034. And I think
Yep.
Sophie, unless something untoward happens, and I can't imagine what that would be, she's gonna be sitting in the epicenter post 2028 in the US and then post 30 in France for the Winter Games of a high degree of focus. I'm not going to necessarily say scrutiny, Phil, but to your point, she's already taken the organization from good to great. Where do you go from great?
That's right. That's right. I think ultimately, and this is all public knowledge. There's a discussion going on between US Ski Snowboard and US Biathlon about potentially what they've termed a strategic partnership, I think, between the two, which I actually think is very smart. Back in my weightlifting days, there was an ongoing discussion about us adopting Paralympic powerlifting. There is an interesting argument that Paralympic powerlifting and weightlifting are both the strength sport of each of those games, but they are in fact different sports, and that is true, they are. And it was a challenging water to navigate between folks who said, okay, this is a really good idea, we combine the strength sports under one roof, and others who said, well, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that the majority of folks who are really paying to be part of a weightlifting organization are then going to be funding in part a Paralympic powerlifting program? And the answer to that was probably yes. So it's interesting knowing how difficult what sounds like a really good idea to the outsider, knowing how difficult that is to navigate for not only Sophie but for Jack Gearhart on the biathlon side is curious to see how that turns out and how that actually happens in practice. And what the benefits to US Biathlon and its athletes might be with the increased resources, capabilities, perhaps even revenues of US Ski Snowboard, and conversely, what the benefits might be to US Ski Snowboard's current folks of membership and organization by having biathlon as part of their group. So, there's ways that I think Sophie thinks somewhat outside of the box, and I'm really curious to see, to your point, what brings 2029 for Sophie. I'm actually curious what she does in 2028 and how Sophie, by the way, a fellow Brit who tends to think about these things in slightly different ways. I'm curious to see how she and other winter NGBs use 28 as a launching pad through to that 6-year run into 34.
Well, fingers crossed. We had a brief conversation 2 weeks ago in Park City on the occasion of the Sport Business Journal Thought Leaders Retreat Conference, which you unfortunately were unable to attend due to your wife's knee replacement surgery.
Correct. Speaking of ski and snowboard, exactly. My wife put 80 years of snowboarding wear on a 40-year-old knee. So that's exactly how that happened.
Right. The parts wear out, unfortunately. But, as I say, fingers crossed, Sophie's agreed to do this podcast. We're still searching for the right date for her, but I'm quite keen to do it because you've ticked off a whole number of things that I would love to explore with her, because I've known her for a number of years. I know that she came out of Chime Sports Management, CSM, the company that Lord Sebastian co-founded back in the day. She's got a wealth of experience both on the commercial side as well as the administration side, having been the CEO of World Surf League. But we'll get to Sophie in another minute. I want to actually get sort of, as I said a minute ago, we're inside 2 years to LA 2028. And what I think the listeners don't really have any concept of is what a CEO who is responsible for fielding a competitive, hopefully medal-winning fencing teams, men and women, faces over the next, call it 22 to 24 months. A, to select a team. B, to get that team ready to compete. C, also deal with the grassroots of membership, which is the core plank in the growth of a national governing body over time. So I'll stop there and kind of flick it over to you and give us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack there, right? I mean, that's kind of like, what are you going to do for the next 2 years was essentially the summary of that question.
It is the summary.
Yeah, but between the hours of about 10:30 p.m. maybe and about 4:30 in the morning, I plan to sleep. That's probably the simplest part of the 2 years I can give you. But look, you've correctly unpacked. There are effectively two areas of the mission statement of most national governing bodies, and the first is let's go and win some shiny things in international competition. Not just the Olympics, but Worlds and Pan Am Games and so on and so forth. Everyone, of course, the pinnacle is the Olympic Games, and that's where we all want to see those come to fruition. But we've got a lot of international competition before that. We send 144 US national teams around the world every year. So the other side is growing the sport. And I think that's where, for me, especially in saying this, I sort of have the viewpoint of the majority of the work in terms of athlete development is somewhat complete. Every sport, or at least the grand majority, will likely know let's say you're sending like us 4 per gender per weapon to the games. You're going to have a short list probably of about maybe as much as 12 athletes who can realistically make it at this point. You're 2 years out. You might have someone unretire, provide you another name on the roster. You probably know that name already. You might have a youth athlete who suddenly has a breakout year, but you're probably going to have a pretty good idea. And indeed, short before too long, you're going to have a good idea because you'll need to support what's called your long list. to the Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and then that will go to LA28. But a lot of that work to get to that team is already done, and now your job is to simply support and ready those athletes to the games. Now, we've got qualification for most sports that'll open somewhere between now and the end of the year, maybe early in next year. For us, it will open in October, and there'll be a 2-year run into the games where our team will be qualifying to get the maximum amount of spots. And in addition, we'll have athletes qualifying through our qualification procedures, culminating in the Olympic and Paralympic trials in April of 28. So I see a lot of the work that needs to be done and accelerated as the games itself and how we take advantage of those in the United States. Earlier, I talked about London and Inspire a Generation. I think that's the job at hand. And I think that if you think about how that relates back, certainly in my own brain, is if you were inspiring a generation in 2012, well, guess the games that you're showing up at, likely LA. So you might have had some who were showing up either in maybe as early as Tokyo, but more likely in Paris. So it's a coming of full circle for me. But that to me, and maybe it's because I went through the London experience and watched it and was part of it as a Londoner and understood how that changed sport and both the good and the bad of that in terms of what we did well as a country in Great Britain and what we perhaps didn't do as well. My lens is this. Our biggest challenge is to put a saber, an epee, or a foil into the hands of every possible person we can between now and the end of August 2028. And then to continue that work, because there will not be the same level of excitement or va-va-voom in a way between LA and Brisbane as there has been between Paris and LA.
No doubt. No doubt. Brisbane is afar off, literally and figuratively. So I'm going to be quite fascinated to see how the Aussies prepare and bring to life the Brisbane Games. But that's right. That's downstream, right?
But it isn't, because part of what happens now will determine how we do, both as a sport, but also how we continue that momentum into Brisbane. For example, we're doing some fencing with people who fenced in films recently. Right. One of them said, I'm in Australia. Well, just so happens we have an American coach in Australia, so actually this works. We can partner up with the Australians and start to build that bridge into the Brisbane Games.
Well, thinking out that far is a requirement. Again, I'll make the point that not many who are not students of sport, and particularly Olympic sport, would really necessarily understand that. But that's super insightful. So between now and 2028, and I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to this, does fencing have a World Cup schedule? How many world championships will occur between now and when the Olympic Games commence in July of 28?
Only one Worlds. So next year it's in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. We just finished up World Championships at this point really days ago in Hong Kong. Very good World Championships where we announced Jackson Wang as a worldwide ambassador as well, former saber fencer for Hong Kong and now worldwide K-pop star. And the first of a few ambassadors for the sport you'll see from both the US and worldwide. And then beyond that, we have a World Cup schedule that effectively simplified, basically is every month. But so the first international will be in November, and it'll go every month pretty much right the way through until we get to the World Championships. And domestically, we have a North American Cup, which is about 4,500 fencers. We have one that's 14,500, which is our nationals, summer nationals, that is. So essentially, when you hit October, there'll be a major fencing event for most of the top-level athletes 2 weekends out of 4 each month. That's simplified, don't get me wrong, but that's basically what will happen.
Other than the U.S. Nationals and the other event you spoke of, are any of the World Cup events going to occur here in the U.S.?
No, we hosted a saber event last year, and we hosted a Paralympic one. We're not hosting one this coming year. We will have an interesting entertainment event coming up between us and Korea, which will be a fun one to do. Essentially, we're building a music and K-pop versus fencing property, which is quite unusual, but it's all designed around marketing the sport and bringing more attention to the sport and bringing new ways of entry to the sport. But that's where we're going next. we will have a Junior World Cup, but then we'll likely host a World Cup in the following season, and we also have the Pan American Championships, which we're hosting in June of 2028, so right before the Olympic and Paralympic Games.
Where is that?
Las Vegas, Nevada.
Becoming quite rapidly the mecca of U.S. sport, at least from a professional perspective. I think that's they're hosting a number of events like that on the Olympic front. So we've got a few minutes left. I'd like you to, if you can, explain the difference for our audience between foil and saber.
So there's three weapons: epee, foil, and saber. Saber is the slashing weapon. So if you've seen Princess Bride, Pirates of the Caribbean, to a degree, lightsaber, even though it's in the name, it's based a little bit around around saber, a little bit around kendo, and a little bit around, as I found out recently, epee, which I was surprised about. So saber as a slashing weapon actually came from cavalry. So the idea was you'd slash the human, kill the human, and steal their horse. And then foil came from the weapon that was used to pierce chain link armor. So that's why it's only on the torso. And then epee, which is literally French for sword, is essentially built for sport. To my knowledge, it was never really used in a combat setting. You might hear epee was used by the French army or what have you. That's because epee simply means sword. So epee is the most defensive. You can have 2 hits. So if you and me are fencing epee, Carl, and I hit you and you hit me, it's a double hit. We each get a point. But in saber and foil, we have something called right of way. So for Americans, the easiest way I can describe that is like having the attacking ball in football, where you have your attacking team on the field and then you can steal the ball and effectively steal right away and make a touchdown. That's the easiest way I can explain it to in the US market.
Would you describe that as 3 events or 3 disciplines within the overall fencing construct?
That's interesting. I'm going to lean towards 3 disciplines within the sport of fencing. And part of that is because in Paralympic fencing, you fence more than 1 weapon. So by definition, they recognize it as being exactly that. And until probably the 90s, there was Olympians who would fence more than 1 weapon. Michael Marks, I believe, I hope I'm correct in saying this, Michael Marks was the last Olympian who made it in more than 1 weapon. I may be incorrect in saying that. I need to double check that
That's
one.
It's all right. I don't know that anybody...
6-time Olympian. Fair. They can go and ask the CEO of USA Fencing. I think he was right.
Yeah.
So it's...
Listen, we've got a few minutes left, and I always ask a few of the same questions to our guests, and they're really fun. So first one is, I happen to know you have a music background. We didn't talk about that, but the first question is the favorite live show or concert you've ever attended where a female artist, female singer-songwriter, or a female-led band was the headliner.
Ooh, female-led singer or songwriter or band was the headliner. Let's see here. God, this would be going back a bit. Alanis Morissette was actually really good recently, and she was the headliner. So I could go with Alanis Morissette back in 2021, maybe at the Pepsi Center as it was then, now Ball Arena here in Denver. I was going to go all the way back to, I was thinking, oh my, it was many years I didn't actually go to any concerts. I just didn't have time, and I've got back into a little bit of the habit, but when I was back working in music, I was thinking maybe it was Kitty and Sugar Coma, which if you can even figure out who those people are, good luck.
I think we're going to stay in the Commonwealth here, and we're going to go with the Canadian Alanis Morissette.
There you go. Perfect.
An extraordinary talent, has always been, and I'm glad to hear that she's still doing what she does so well. That's a good one. Second question is similar. Not that you have time between 10:30 p.m. and 4:30 a.m. to watch your favorite streaming shows or other movies or whatever, but of late, do you have a favorite either motion picture or show that you are locked onto?
Ted Lasso. I love Ted Lasso. I mean, there's a couple of people in my life, because of the reverse sort of nature of coming over and running American sports, but have described me as a reverse Ted Lasso. But I just, I think it's a great series. Series, as we're recording, I'm not quite sure when this will exactly come out, but with series 3, is that correct? Yes, season 3 has just come out. So it's sort of, I've watched the first episode, which is set in Kansas City, and now presumably they'll go back to Richmond this coming episode. I think that's probably going to come come out tonight or maybe tomorrow. But I love that series. I think it's very well done. I think people involved in that clearly know both sides of that experience really well, because there's a lot of nuance that I particularly pick up on in that show because I've lived in both countries. So yeah, hands down, Ted Lasso.
Well, you're not alone.
No.
I am a Lasso fan, full stop, upside, downside, and sideways. I thought in the World Cup coverage here recently ended that they did an extraordinary job of leveraging the Lasso characters in the whole World Cup scenario.
100% they did. I thought they did really, really well, especially considering, it wasn't an Apple TV production,
Right.
as it were.
Right.
So, and it goes back to that same thing of, the idea that NBC had of in sort of merging culture and sport.
And they did a really good job of that, by the way.
Yeah.
Last question, and it's my favorite one. And this is your favorite word, the sort of touchstone word for you, especially as a leader. Words are so important, those we use, and I think as importantly, those we choose not to use. So is there a specific word that is your favorite one, or that is a go-to for you? And what is it and why?
You probably have to ask my team. I would go, it's interesting. I go with either because or why, which is effectively the same thing of like always look for the why. What's the underlying reason? Why is the motivation for somebody doing something? What's in it for them? What's their perspective? Why is program A in a national governing body can lead to land on member X in Y way? And because. So I'd say because. And always explain, a part of what we do is we serve communities and national governing bodies. And I think one of the things that you have to do well is not just go out and market your sport to the wider world where you're speaking to people who don't know anything about fencing. The opposite is true when you're speaking to the people who do. So you've got to spend time on explaining. And why did we make this choice? Why did we go this route? They are owed that explanation because guess what? Not only are they your customers, they're your members, and they actually own you. They are the people who elect your board. They are the people who pay the dues. We're a nonprofit. That's our people. That's our ownership.
I love that. There's no why question here, Phil, but I'm so pleased you joined this podcast because we got a chance to hear an extraordinary story and learn more about fencing than other than yourself, your team, and the fencers that are in the marketplace would never know. I can't thank you enough. You've been gracious with your time.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, Carl. It's the best podcast ever now, right? Not the best boss ever.
There you go. We're going to take that one to the bank.
There you are. Exactly. Cheers.